Anti-theistic theories, that's right. Well, I think you can use mine because I don't expect to be doing it. Right?
You want an answer from that?
Not yet. Hang on to your notes. Keep making them. What do the anti-theistic theories have to do with natural theism? What's that?
Anti is against God.
Our first subdivision in our study of theology proper is natural theism. We've been looking at a naturalistic, theistic arguments. And what is the end result of those arguments? What do they purport to prove? Right. So they intend to prove theism. That is, a belief in God based on nature. This is all under naturalistic, theistic arguments. Everything we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks has to do with, basically, human reason and based on natural laws of cause and effect. Alright? So everything has to do with from nature. Now, it's important to recognize that just as you have seen well illustrated in the contest, in the dialogue between Paul Kurtz and Norman Geisler, that a person may not be convinced with the naturalistic theistic arguments. They may be aware of them and they may profess that they don't work, that it's not good enough.
That's on your state of mind.
Well, we're talking about states of mind, right? This is the arguments that you can make from nature, but on the other hand, you need to be aware that there are many beliefs, disbeliefs in the existence of God that people have in the natural realm. All right? So naturalistic theism is opposed by naturalistic anti-theism, people that are not convinced that there is a God or that he's the kind of God that, you know, he's personal and powerful and immanent. There's two words here. What does word A mean? Imminent. Imminent. Your judgment is imminent. Just around the corner. Right? Certain and soon. Right? What does immanent mean? You will, as we work through these anti-theistic theories. Immanent. Very important to understand that word. It's the opposite of transcendent. Transcendent means overarching, overall, everywhere, out there, perhaps unknowable. So for most of us, space is transcendent. All right? Womanhood for men is transcendent. It's out there, but it's untouchable. A man can never be a woman. He can never experience womanhood. All right? In that sense. And when you're trying to understand God, all right, God to some people is transcendent, that he's just too far out there if he exists and we can't know him. But immanent means that he is around us and in us and knowable. Right?
Is that
transcendent.
Right.
Yeah. Now, these anti-theistic theistic beliefs. Very often will argue to this, that God is transcendent. And they will argue with the word. They'll argue with the terminology. They'll say, what's God? Define God. One of the guys that used to come to our Sunday school, to our young people's, just down the road here, Smith is his name. His dad is a steel plant worker. And Al got saved and his dad won't have anything to do with it. He says, you want to talk to me about God? Okay, go ahead. Which one? He disbelieves that there is one God. And how can you know that one for sure is the God as opposed to another God? And that's all part of theism. It comes right down to an anti-theistic belief. Right? Let's look at them. We're just going to get started on them today. We are 2 classes behind. One, because we watched the video. Second, because you had a spare. Right. So today I'd like to look at atheism, agnosticism, and evolution as anti-theistic theories. First 3 of the 12 that he discusses in this chapter. Right. So, define for me atheism.
Belief that there is no God.
Okay, now, there are various kinds of atheism that you should be aware of. What are the 3 kinds that Schaeffer identifies?
Dogmatic, skeptical, and ritual.
All right? And he adds another class, practical. Practical atheism, and then speculative atheism. A speculative atheist is a person that really believes it. A practical atheist is a person that may not believe it, but acts like it. And even a Christian can be a practical atheist. You know that? A Christian can act like God doesn't exist. Right? They do, yeah. And so there's a world of difference. There are more practical atheists than there are speculative atheists or philosophic atheists.
So speculative would say that he could within a sense of permanent.
Yeah, he probably would. Right? So you've got, people believe different things even though they may call themselves an atheist. A dogmatic atheist is somebody that concludes that God does not exist, he's absolutely disproved his existence. There is no God and I can prove it. Right? Now that's, as Geisler pointed out, a very absurd position. How can you disprove the existence of God? What does a person have to do to disprove the existence of God? Right.
You have to have the answer to everything.
Yeah, you have to have the answers to everything in the universe. You have to be big enough. You have to have gone out to the farthest reaches of the universe to find out if God is there. Maybe he's on Pluto. Have you ever been to Pluto? That's an absurd position to take. Right? And that's easy to argue with a person. Skeptical atheism is more difficult to argue against. Basically, this guy was a speculative. There's not much difference between a speculative atheist and an agnostic. They're similar. A skeptical atheist doubts God's existence. Sure. Yeah. And then a virtual atheist is a person that, he believes in principles that lead to a denial of God's existence. He may not be very consistent, but there's some things that he believes that he can't accept God's existence. Britannica gives a few names. You may want to jot some of these names down so that if you ever come across a name, one of these names, that you will have an idea of where to peg them. Karl Marx was a proponent of atheism. He taught that, don't try to write all this stuff down, let me just make a statement for each one. Karl Marx was a materialist. He believed that religion reflects a person's place in a socio-economic order. And therefore religion alienates a man from what he does, and therefore alienates man from his true self. And that's why he rejected God. Right? You have to remember that Karl Marx started out with an economic theory. His religious theory was tied to economics. Right? Isn't it interesting that economics has been proven to fail in Marxist Leninism? It has failed. It just doesn't work. We've seen that in the last month in the news. It's failed politically and also economically. Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, another famous humanist. Machiavelli. Machiavelli. He has written a classic work in 2 or 3 centuries ago on politics. Machiavelli said that there's no connection between politics and religion. I believe it was I haven't read enough, someday I will, but if I get it right, Machiavelli taught that might makes right. He basically developed this idea of survival of the fittest, and that if you want to win, you got to be strong.
So the bully on the street is the power again.
Yeah, Machiavellian principles. If you want to survive, you got to be strong, right? And of course, his theory, is very popular today. Always has been. But basically, in order to give a foundation to his theory, he denied that politics is connected to God's existence. There is no God. He's not governing politics in this world. You can see a natural connection there. It's up to man. I mean, if you don't smarten up, somebody's going to step on you. See? God has nothing to do with it. That's Machiavellian politics, right? So practical atheist. Now there are 2 other philosophers that whose names you will run across in theology and philosophy: Hume, Hume, and Kant, Kant. Hume and Kant. These are philosophers that basically said that reason is restricted. We can only understand things that we can experience sensually. These men, by the way, were not atheists, but they were, they would fall into the category of virtual atheists. They proposed theories that led many people to assume atheism. All right? Hume and Kant taught that reason is restricted to sensual experience. In other words, you can only understand the things that you can actually experience. And can you experience God? Many people would say, yes, you can. They would deny that you can experience God with your 5 senses. Denying the power thereof, 2 Timothy chapter 3. It's part of the We live in perilous times. Paul lived in perilous times, and so ever since then we see the outgrowth of some of these philosophies. Fellow by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach, F-E-U-E-R, Bach, with an H. Died in 1872, and his idea was that God is merely a projection of man's ideals, and so if you just get rid of, if you disbelieve in this mental idea of God, then that liberates you, that you can realize your own self-potential. Right? Prominent theme. Very similar to Sigmund Freud, who died in 1939. He's a famous, one of the founders of modern psychology and psychiatry. Sigmund Freud, an Italian doctor. Pardon? No, he lived in Vienna. Well, he may be German, but he lived in Italy. And he said that belief in God is a regression to a childlike state of projecting onto your helpless nature the image of a comforting father figure. Freud said that it's childish to believe in God. To believe in God means you're acting like a little kid, and you have this idea that there's a big strong man up there that can help you. Right? That was his concept. Right? So modern psychology is one of those sciences where God's existence is practically denied. Charles Darwin, who died in 1882, was essentially essentially argued that the world did not come here at the hands of God, but it happened by chance. There's no God, it happened, it evolved. Right? So, from a scientific angle, his ideas have produced many atheists. One summer, about 10 years ago, there was a youth group came up from Michigan and helped us here during Vacation Bible School, and there was a kid saved. He was living in Toronto, and his grandfather lived in Goulais. And he just happened to meet, and he was saved. I met him about 4 or 5 years later in the lounge at the university, and he had rejected his Christianity because he was in a science program at the university, and he had adopted evolution. He couldn't understand. He couldn't believe that there was a God because the scientific evidence was just too much on the side of evolution, according to the people he was listening to. You can't believe in evolution and God at the same time. Right? So he had been persuaded the other way. Right? Now, I don't know. I believe he was genuinely saved. It's these people that have caused him to stumble, and they're going to go to hell, a deeper spot, too, because of what they've done. But there you have it. Scientific theory produces practical atheists. Right? Friedrich, F-R-I-E-D-R-I-C-K, Friedrich Nietzsche, N-I-E-T, S-C-H-E, who died in 1900. This guy was supposedly a theologian. Guess what he taught? And Nietzsche is a name that you will run across, no doubt. He declared God is dead. He declared that God is dead, and therefore all of our traditional values that are based on a belief in God are gone. Therefore, this frees man to fulfill himself. These German theologians. Yep. But he was responsible for the God is dead theory, and he proposed nihilism, that is a denial of all traditional values, and can't know anything for sure, so this frees man to fulfill his own self. Sartre, who John Ankerberg referred to on his first program, Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher, S-A-R-T-R-E. His philosophy was that man is alone in the universe, and he is free to determine his own values and that true freedom depends on a denial of God. True freedom depends on a denial of God. The Christian has the exact opposite. If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed, and the truth shall set you free. Christ said that true freedom comes from recognizing Him and following Him.
Right. He's wrong. He's totally wrong.
So this is all part of the devil's lie that our society. Well, they are free in a sense, rebelliously free.
If they believe they don't not be responsible, then what's
like if you don't have to answer to somebody that doesn't exist. Once I thought he existed, but he really doesn't. Santa Claus isn't real, so I don't have to worry about Santa Claus ever slapping my hands.
No, or he can't be good at night. He can't be bad at night.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a very logical thing. To deny God leads directly to humanism, that man is the master of his destiny and control of everything that happens in the world, politically, scientifically, socially, economically. You see, that's what these guys are all talking about. Philosophically, they all basically deny God, and so this is why they're famous in this world. These guys are famous people. The guys at the university love these guys. Right? Jean-Paul Sartre. Thomas Huxley. Thomas Huxley. Huxley. And John Stuart Mill. Actually, we're getting into one of the other ones. I think, which was it? The ninth anti-theistic theory that Schaeffer talks about is logical positivism. And these guys, the Britannica, discussed them under atheism. Thomas Huxley and John Stuart Mill were logical positivists. Logical positivists. And they very similar, Britannica says, to atheism. They proposed that any discussion about God's existence is meaningless. Discussion about God's existence is meaningless. True knowledge can only be derived from experience and observation. It sounds just like that guy, right? That you've been watching, Paul Kurtz. Right? He says, I don't know if there's a God, I've never seen it. Remember him saying that? Right? You can only know what you've experienced. Of course, now they narrowly define what human experience is. They narrow it to, if I feel God, then I know He's existent. If I see God with my eyes, then I'll believe He exists. If I can touch Him with my hands, if I can hear Him with my ears, then I'll believe that God exists. What they are denying is the whole realm, and this is what Schaeffer points out in his discussion of atheism here, that agnostics and atheists deny the reality of certain kinds of human experience. Right? Right. The spiritual and emotional. Right? But anyway, these guys have already, their premises, they've already established the bounds of what they'll accept as true knowledge. The very notion of God to a positivist is impossible to discuss. You can't even discuss it. There's no way that we have... it's like trying to discuss Martians. Anybody seen The Martian? To them, it is. Now, of course, there's a great difference between Martians and God. Martians didn't do anything. They never have. They've left no tracks anywhere.
So they probably discuss God before Martians before they discuss Him.
Okay, so a couple of things in refutation of these ideas that we've been looking at. There are two things that Schaeffer states under atheism that I think that you should point out, you should highlight. First of all, atheism is inconsistent. Atheism is inconsistent because it requires a denial of the immaterial aspects of man. Including his will. Atheism is inconsistent because it denies the immaterial aspects of man, such as his will. We touched on this before. The teleological argument, remember, that we talked about under naturalistic theistic arguments? The teleological argument argues that the complexity and the design of all different kinds of systems, because they work perfectly in harmony with one another, evidences that there is intelligence in the first cause. Right? It couldn't have happened. Chance never produces such a thing. It's like believing that, to use Norm Geisler's illustration, it's like believing that a tornado that goes through a junkyard can produce a Boeing 747. That's the absurdity of the evolutionary alternative to the teleological argument. Right? They're inconsistent. Totally inconsistent. Chance has never produced anything in great detail, and a denial of God based on the belief that everything has come from the material world by chance. That is inconsistent because it has no explanation for the immaterial nature of man. There's no explanation for that. Why does man have intelligence? What gene does intelligence come from? It doesn't. Right? Well, brains do, but all animals have brains. Why is the human brain distinct from that of a chimpanzee or from a bird? And why are all human brains distinct? That's it. Without exception. So, anyway, the first thing that Schaeffer says is that atheism is inconsistent because it denies the immaterial. Secondly, it assumes knowledge greater than the limits that his own creed allows. They got a lousy presupposition, he says. Atheism is rotten because they're assuming that you can disprove the existence of God. Come on. They deny the very existence of God, but in essence, an atheist makes himself God, because he claims to have the ability to be able to disprove it. Well, no man can jump off this world into space and independently and empirically, according to accepted scientific methods, disprove the existence of God. Just can't do it.
Your word that assume knowledge greater than their own creed,
Yeah, than their own creed allows. This is what Schaeffer says. They assume knowledge greater than the limits of their own creed. They have limited by creed. They have stated that there is no God. They have limited what they will believe in. But by doing so, they are putting themselves in the absurd position of being the ones that determine what that is. They determine that there is no God. Well, how do they determine that? Well, they put themselves in the position of knowing that. No man can know that. To know that, you have to be as great as God, or greater. Does that make sense to you?
greater than what God could be.
To use the illustration once again, to be able to disprove God's existence, you have to be able to go anywhere in space to have proved it. And man is not capable of doing such a thing. Okay. All right, let's move on to a study of agnosticism. Agnosticism. What is... Oh, is time up? Well, I was going by the tape. It's 45 minutes on one side. No, we go to 10:30. It's not quite 10:30.
You got somewhere to go, you're taking the oven.
Agnosticism. You tell me. What's the difference between agnosticism and atheism? Maybe what? Give me a complete English sentence telling me what agnosticism is. State it. Put a complete thought across.
Someone who is not sure that there's no God, but not wanting to accept it.
Right. What were you going to say? Right. So it's a position, it's a philosophical position, it's a religious position, that a person doesn't absolutely deny the existence of God, nor does he absolutely accept the existence of God. It's an in-between, it's an unconvinced position. It's an open question. And technically, that's what Paul Kurtz was. Right?
Before he was done, he called something.
Did he?
He's arguing about whether he knew he said it or not.
Well, again, there's very little difference between a skeptical atheist and an agnostic.
That's true. He disagreed with everything. So he was in the morning to do with that.
He was a good illustration of the limits that an agnostic places on his experiences. He said, a practical agnostic or skeptic today out there will say, I will only accept the stuff as real that was within these bounds. And outside of that bounds is naturalistic theistic arguments, the evidence in nature. He won't accept the evidence in nature, even though the scriptures say that that's sufficient evidence. They refuse to accept the nature and evidence as part of what he acknowledges to be true and experiential. By definition, that's the problem of the agnostic. Anyway, there are two different viewpoints included in agnosticism according to Britannica. Maybe just to develop your notes here a little bit. Agnosticism suspends judgment on ultimate questions. That's one thing. It always suspends judgment on ultimate questions You just can't know for sure.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
What does the man to say God is?
I didn't look at that.
Wonder whether agnostic, atheist, or
Probably just takes no position. It probably gives all the views without. Well, they would never. This is a source book of information. I put it all down like a dictionary without commenting on it.
yeah,
Yeah. All right. So one aspect of agnosticism is the suspension of judgment on ultimate questions. They just won't. They won't commit themselves. Secondly, historically, they have always been hostile in their opposition to biblical theism. Agnostics are hostile in their opposition to biblical theism. I'm quite certain that Paul Kurtz would do his best in his classes at the university to influence students away from creationism and theism, right? He would constantly argue that you just can't know.
You never have more philosophy, science teacher, philosopher says there is no God. Can't prove people lost somewhere. They're animal. Challenge anyone. Arms hold us out, no drawback. It doesn't break off who lives and dies.
Yeah, I've heard about a kid that took him up on it.
Who dropped it? Who's it?
We were at a youth retreat about 2 years ago, and the guy that did it, who was the speaker, he told that story, but he dragged it out beautifully. He'd just get to the punchline, where he was just about ready to drop it, and then he'd go off on a rabbit trail somewhere. He did that about 3 times, and everybody was just screaming at him, "Well, tell us what happened," It was good. I forget his name. He runs a summer's missions organization to Europe. The King's servants. That's what they call them. Anyway. Yes, so a synonymous word for agnosticism was skepticism. The most famous proponent of agnosticism in this country was, or around the world for that matter, was Thomas Huxley. He's the one that coined the term in 1869. And in his own words, an agnostic was a person who repudiated traditional Jewish Judeo-Christian theism and yet at the same time disclaimed doctrinaire atheism, leaving such questions open. So Kurtz was correct that it's a more sophisticated position than atheism. It's a more reasonable position. You want me to give that sentence to you again? According to Huxley, an agnostic is a person who repudiates theism and atheism.
they still stick to that one bit.
But they leave such questions open. Well, yeah. Kurtz is an example. He believes, well, I suppose he would lean more toward the atheism. Not the doctrinaire atheism. Only this is the point, that this doctrinaire atheism says there is no God, we can prove it. Right? Now, no agnostic will go that far. They may agree with the practical. They may be skeptical atheists. Anybody that doesn't believe in God is an atheist. I don't care what kind of an atheist, they're an atheist. Right? But you've got hardcore atheists, and then you've got the philosophic atheists, and then you've got the practical atheists. Right? So anybody that's not a theist is an atheist, and all agnostics are atheists. It's just that they don't agree. They're all middle-of-the-road atheists. Okay? Now, Schaeffer has a couple of comments to make about agnosticism. Arguing against it. He said, one problem with the agnostics is that they're unwilling to accept the impressions of the mind or to be convinced by reason. And Kurtz is a beautiful example of that. Geisler was hammering him. You know, he was giving him argument after argument, and this guy was saying, I don't accept that, I don't accept that, I don't accept that, I don't accept that. By definition. See that? They're unwilling to accept rational arguments. Agnostics, Schaeffer says, are negative in character. They look around them and said, I don't believe that. And I don't believe that either. And I reject that. And that's not true. And that argument doesn't apply. You know? They themselves set the limits. That's what I was trying to establish before when I was illustrating that. That a basic problem of an agnostic is that they set the limits too narrow, so narrow that they would never be convinced that God exists because of by definition, the parameters that they set for knowing God. If they say the only way I'll know God is if I shake my hands with Him, or if I see Him with my own eyeballs, or hear Him with my own ears. That's basically what an agnostic is. They will not be convinced unless they see Him with their senses. That's right. And so God will someday convince them. But that is the problem with agnosticism. Paul, in Romans chapter 1, says that which may be known of God is manifest among them, and all that they're just unwilling to see it. They're not really looking. Romans chapter 3. How does Paul put that? Romans chapter 3, verse 10 and 11. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understands. There is none that seeks after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are all together become unprofitable. They don't seek God. Okay? There isn't an agnostic alive, a skeptic alive, that is really seriously seeking God. If they were really seriously seeking God, they would have found Him. Because the evidence is there. And this is the dilemma that we're faced, and we'll always be faced with it. You can't convince people to open their eyes. Right? That's the problem with agnosticism. Schaeffer says they're inconsistent in the application of their denials. They'll deny this line of evidence, right? Yeah. He says they discredit the certitude regarding knowledge. They engender distrust as to common facts and forces of existence. You can't put it any better than that. That's the problem with agnosticism. It engenders distrust with